Maggie X. Ronald, Dribble Down Economics. By Isaac Does Art, maybe Jude. Margaret has never felt this way before. Even her husband hadn't managed to excite her as much as Regan had. She knew she was enamored from the moment she set eyes on him, knowing that their two souls were connected in the greatest transatlantic partnership ever to be formed. They were political and spiritual soulmates. Thatcher had first set her eyes upon the land of the free at the age of all but 42 in the year of 1967. Her 6 weeks there had convinced her of two things. With a strong transatlantic relationship, the horrors of communism could be defeated. American men were wusses. But it was only 8 years later that she had finally been blessed with the most life-altering of trips. It was a surprisingly mild April, but the warm Californian sun had meant that any hint of cold British weather was unrecognizable on the other side of the pond. Reagan was the then governor of California. His stark blue eyes shone like the headlights of a privatized railway train, and his smile seemed to brighten her whole world. A month later, she had doubled down on her infatuation, receiving a courteous thank you letter. It soon became the future prime minister's most treasured possession, and unbeknownst to her loving, although dull husband, was soon coated in lipstick marks and pussy juice. In it, he had described himself as an enthusiastic supporter of her, but she hoped, dreamed even, that they could become more. How she wished she could kiss Regan as much as she had the beautiful letter. It is rather hard to French kiss a piece of paper without suffering some nasty cuts. A lot had changed since 1975. Reagan was now President of the United States, and Thatcher herself had risen to a higher office, that of Prime Minister. Both of their terms were in full swing, having received a heartfelt and reassuring re-election, which had lit up Margaret's thought, as few things did these days. It was a day similar in all but date and attitude to their first meeting. Although marginally colder, the sun beat down from a cloud-free sky, and Maggie felt a cool, rousing breeze on her face. Walking through the military base, her heart swelled with confidence and pride, knowing that she would be able to provide her the best of news to Reagan. Her recent meeting with charming and sexy Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had gone to plan. Whilst he was sometimes disarming, she had been able to force further agreements, and she felt deep within her body that the end of communism was all a matter of time. It made her feel butterflies in her private parts. Her black girl boss heels clicked commandingly on the concrete as she walked towards the meeting room, flanked on either side by security guards and followed close behind by her personal secretary. She had specifically requested that whoever was in the role of Ministry for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs this week miss out on the meeting. They seemed to change so rapidly as of late, and Margaret was irritated with the combination of flights and pandering. So she got her way, as she always did, and they would not be coming to this meeting in particular. She felt a warmth in her chest, but her hands quivered slightly with anticipation. As she reached closer and closer to the meeting she had looked forward for so long, clad in a characteristically smart navy suit, neck and ears adorned with pearls, and her hair perfectly coiffed with her usual neckerchief on. Maggie felt as confident and self-assured in her appearance as it was possible to be. Finally reaching the door to the right of the building, she was led by one of her security guards through a series of doors and corridors until she got to the room that she knew deep inside her soul contained her darling, Ronald Regan. This service member gently pushed the door open, revealing Regan, seated expectingly. His devilishly wrinkly and rectangular face beamed in her direction. "Mrs. Thatcher, it is a pleasure to see you again." His accent always made her feel things. already excited. She reciprocated his warm greeting and stepped inside the meeting room, tailed by the other security guard and her secretary. Regan shifted on his feet, faltering from his usual self-assured demeanor and drawing attention to his sharply pressed all-American suit. Naturally, it was navy, expressing his strong, broad shoulders, and was in striking contrast with the tight, well-tied, and positively suggestive red tie around his neck. To be quite frank, she admitted, Regan seemed a little hot under the collar. Looking up and down his body, Margaret eventually met Regan's eyes, and the two lingered there for just a second too long for a purely political partnership. Embarrassed, she made a quick return to the service members and secretary standing behind her. For reasons of confidentiality, she looking at each of them in turn, Mr. Regan and I would greatly appreciate it if you were to sit outside for this meeting. The service members looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable with abandoning the one woman they had asked to protect. Come on now. The lady's not for turning, one of the service members said. Mrs. Thatcher responded with a tight smile. To be honest, no man in their right mind would try and cross the Iron Lady, and so it was inevitable that they looked over at one another and gave a severe nod before ducking out of the room, waiting patiently outside. In their defense, it was unlikely that anyone had been able to enter the room already, undetected by Regan's guards, and so it was very unlikely that an attempt on either of their lives could be made. This includes you, Thatcher stated pointedly at her now intimidated secretary. The woman stammered for a few seconds, desperate to convince Mrs. Thatcher that her presence in the room was necessary for her shorthand skills. But Margaret was not having it, and she scurried out moments later. Finally, she let out a breath, not bothering to finish the sentence. It's good to see you, Mrs. Thatcher, Regan said. Likewise, Mr. Regan. It has been far, far too long for my liking. There was a moment of silence between the two of them as they sat down awkwardly at the meeting table. If Margaret searched within herself, she probably would have realized that in no way had she prepared beyond the moment she opened the door. Everything from here onward was like an unregulated free market, terrifying but wonderful at the same time, and it would arguably be significantly better if she had scripted it. She wasn't sure what she had to say to Regan now, but she knew it had come from the heart. What she was not expecting, however, was for him to speak first. You're a very strong woman. You've always impressed me. From the moment I met you, I knew that we were politically kindred spirits. And whilst you're very effective in cursing the unions, I feel like the opposite is happening to my heart. It was beyond anything she could have ever imagined. And he continued, Margaret, you fill me with so much hope and joy as the people of the valleys in the north lack. I practically haven't slept since your secretary called mine and let me know the success of your trip to Moscow. Maggie loved the way he talked, the irritatingly inaccurate Americanized pronunciation of Moscow made her almost positively long. She leant forward, placing her arms upon the meeting table and clasping her hands together. I feel very much the same, Mr. President. His eyes were searching, expectant almost, seeming to be begging for more praise than her short reciprocation allowed it, as if Maggie was edging him. Soon, she would literally be. That is to say, Mr. President. His eyes were transfixed by matching, genetically mutated blue ones. You're the most wonderful and like-minded man I've ever met. She was careful to avoid a mention of her own husband's inadequacies, and continued, The way you artfully managed to shift your country's politics so far to the right, your federal judges perfectly align with your politics, and all of that help you've provided to help overthrow those dirty communist governments in the Middle East and Central America. Mr. Regan, I am not only proud of your strong and admirable action, but proud to know you. It was clear even to an outside observer, that this level of praise greatly excited the president. In less than statesmanly ways, compelled by some ungodly, although deeply traditional and Christian force, both Reagan and Thatcher stood up from the meeting table, making their way towards each other on the side furthest from the door, stopping with but half a meter between another. They suddenly became aware of what they were doing, but it was too late in the game for shame. Reagan and Margaret had already bared a surprising volume of their hearts to one another, and unless she was very mistaken, Maggie knew that she strongly reciprocated her political and spiritual feelings for him. Like the good conservative Christians they were, the two of them prayed silently, almost in tandem, for the forgiveness of God for what they were about to do. But a union of two souls in such a perfect political manner must be consummated, regardless of the traditional teachings of the Bible. There's no other way to get around the perfection that the two of them together were. And upon accepting that even the Holy Spirit and God could not help them now, Margaret stepped closer than she ever thought she would get the chance to. Reagan inhaled sharply, and she faltered for a second, worrying about the existence of a grave mistake. But his eyes and his demeanor were inviting and as unregulated as their economic ideologies. Taking the greatest risk of her life, she leaned forwards, lifting herself higher, the final few inches towards Reagan's face that she desperately needed to make. Their eyes met as she leaned forward, and the Iron Lady softening as her anti-communist lips met his, and she felt a spark unlike anything she had ever had before leap between the two of them. She drew back from their tender kiss. "Would you like to deregulate some industries with me?" "Yes, Ronald. Yes, I do." Ronald then grabbed her by the waist, pulling her close. She felt him hard against her and drew in a short breath, shifting her weight to spread her legs slightly and pulling herself closer to him. Twisting round so Reagan's back was to the meeting table, she kissed him harder, pushing Reagan against the table. Their bodies were pressed together, and their jaws clashed with such reckless abandon that you'd think they were not socially tamed. They had been possessed with an animalistic vigor not dissimilar to the Hobbesian concept of human nature from which their shared ideology was predicted upon. This moment put the tender, almost chaste first kiss into the most harsh of perspectives as the two teeths clash, noses bumping. They were in a mindless frenzy, Reagan nipping with his white American teeth at her earlobes, clad with her usual giant pearls. She gasped, and their lips moved back to one another's. It was only when Maggie found herself to be biting Reagan's lips, startled back to reality by the shocked moan that escaped his capitalist throat, that she realized just how far she was willing to go with him. Of course, in the most private recesses of her mind, and in the back of her brain when in bed, she had considered it in great detail, but more than often, it was through the medium of her husband, clad in suit and often slammed against a wall whilst she undressed him. Oh yes, now she was thinking very hard indeed. Good Lord, had never before wanted so desperately to do things with a man. Reagan was still gasping from their kiss. She wrapped a hand tightly around his tie, giving a small, suggestive, but no way violating tug. She asked, "Is this okay?" Reagan's eyes lit up in a way she had not expected, but was incredibly grateful to see. He nodded enthusiastically. "Use your words, Mr. President," she warned. "Yes, Mrs. Thatcher." "Yes, Mrs. Thatcher, what?" A hint of grin spreading to the corners of her face. "Yes, Thatcher. Please, please." "Good boy," she grinned, pulling down his tie, tight around his neck and leaving him red in the face after a few seconds, blood pressure immense in all departments and head spinning. "Did you like that, little boy?" she asked, suddenly surprisingly self-conscious. Gasping, Reagan struggled to reply, but his hard cock gave most of the answer. Yes, Mrs. Thatcher." "Good." Just as she was about to lean in once again for another girl boss Thatcherite kiss, Reagan stopped. He seemed to suck in a pained breath as if he was about to admit something horrific, or actually repent for one of his numerous war crimes. "Thatcher, please peg me." Her jaw went slack for a second, before regaining her iron composure. If Regan wanted to take it in the ass, that was fine. It wasn't like he was promoting the gay lifestyle in schools, after all. She tried to stop, her voice quivering with the anticipation she felt. "All right, Mr. Regan. I wasn't even sure how far you'd be willing to go, but if that's what you want..." "More than anything, Mrs. Thatcher, and please call me Ronald." "If that's what you wish, Ronald." A sly, grateful smile broke onto his capitalist face, but Thatcher faltered. "Wait, Ronald, I can't use anything besides..." She looked panicked for a second, but Ronald's face didn't change. "My fingers?" "That's fine." He smiled delightful. She pulled him into a quick and harsh kiss, leaving him winded and his lips desperate for her touch again. Lying back on the table, papers pushed aside to make room for him, and Operation Cyclone flies fluttered to the floor. "You dirty, dirty criminal, Mr. Regan. What were you thinking invading Granada like that, He shuddered, desperate for her to tell him just how useless he really was. "And what about the government debt, She barely waited for a response before pressing her soft, middle-aged lips to his, suddenly desperate for contact. Ronald Regan gasped as Margaret ran her fingers through his gelled hair, giving him a sudden hard tug that let him know that he was her private property. Maggie could see it in his eyes that he was desperately aching for her to be in him. Leaning just far enough away that she would appear stronger and more commanding, she placed a palm to his chest and pushed him back. His back was flat on the table and her harsh and hornily stern face was looking down on him. "Rather laissez-faire, don't you think, Ronald?" she asked, still getting used to the feeling of his name in her mouth. It was so personal, far more personal than entering him. The Prime Minister noticed her hands were on his belt, quickly unbuckling it in an attempt to relieve him from the freshly ironed fabric of the suit trousers that contained his tight package. Ronald looked positively bowled over by the whole situation, still appearing honestly starstruck as Maggie managed to yank his trousers halfway down his legs. "Take your shoes off, Ronald," she commanded. "Yes, Mrs. Thatcher," he obliged, unlacing his smart presidential shoes as quickly as his overwhelmingly horny brain could allow. Kicking them off with an instant, he lay back down. Margaret nimbly removed her neckerchief, unfolding it so that it became a long piece of silky fabric, lifting his awkward placed arms from his sides above his head. He let a small gasp of realization and longing as she tied his wrist together with the soft scarf, just tight enough that he couldn't really move his hands. His personal strategic defense initiative had certainly been disbanded. God, he thought, he'd love to be tied up fully by her. It would be so nice to lie there on his stomach, hard dick pressing it to the floor, with his hands and feet tied together behind his back. "There we go," Maggie said in a breathy voice that surprised even her. Stepping back to survey her work, she smirked and leaned forwards into a soft, passionate kiss. Pulling back, Margaret wrapped a slender, strong hand around his neck, and once again he begged for her to make him feel so wonderfully lightheaded. Regan let her know without a shadow of a doubt that her girl bossery was absolutely desired. The tight, reassuring squeeze on his neck was all he needed to involuntarily spread his legs, wrapping around Maggie T's waist on either side and letting out a slow moan. Seconds later, she was pulling his body up by the tie, a warning look in her eyes as another moan rippled from his mouth. "When I say you're a good boy, Ronald, I don't mean you can just do anything you want. Now shut up, as one of the officers outside will hear your pitty little moaning, and he wouldn't want those big, strong men to possibly view their president as the weak little piece of shit he really is. Right, Ronald?" Ronald Regan shook his head, desperately horny and wanting to oblige. "No, Mrs. Thatcher." "That's a good boy," she said, sliding a finger into his mouth not to make sure he was really quiet. "And good boys get railed, if that's what they really want." Margaret removed his tie and peeled his capitalist underwear off of him and linked his inflexible middle-aged man legs as close to above his head as they would go, exposing his bare and surprisingly waxed asshole. She could tell he'd been preparing for the occasion, and she felt a swell of joy within her, and a bit of swell elsewhere too. His hard member would be, to anyone but her, and potentially his wife, a sight for sore eyes. But she drank the image in, neglecting him the privilege of touch where he wanted it most. She paused for a second, considering the merits of pressing the heel of her sharp black shoes against his loose balls, slowly but surely, but concluded that, like the privatization of the NHS, crushing his unions were for another day. She spat into her hand, spreading it around his Reaganite rim in one of the worst forms of makeshift lube she has ever used. To be frank, the olive oil she had found in Number 10's kitchen had been better than this, but it would be the president feeling the stretch, not her. "Are you okay, Ronald? Is this all right?" She put a slight pressure on his entrance with a finger and pressed her way inside his as he relaxed. After a few minutes more of kissing along the sharpest hickey that Regan had ever received, girl boss Maggie T slid another of her slender fingers slowly into Regan's gaping, deregulated hole. It was clear he hadn't done this with his wife before, as the sounds that he was attempting to make indicated a level of enjoyment that she suspected he hadn't been able to achieve before. The market was truly free, and demanded sure was causing supply. "That's a good boy," Thatcher growled. A few minutes later, Regan was panting with enjoyment, clearly trying not to be loud or calm before he was told. As he opened his mouth to speak, the Iron Lady hit his prostate. "Thank you." A sudden moan escaped his mouth, losing what little composure he had left. For this proud but not boastful smile out on Maggie's face. I would like to do this again sometime, Maggie," Regan said with a shaky breath. A frown broke out on his face. "It's still Mrs. Thatcher to you, Ronald, or Prime Minister." Humiliated, Regan looked away, like a dog told off, longing for his mistress's approval. I'm sorry, Mrs. Thatcher." And with that, girl boss Maggie T leaned over, finally allowing for him to have his neglected cock touched as she wrapped her hand around the shaft, thumbing the tip. For Regan, the sudden contact, after it had been denied for so long, with so much edging and teasing, was too much for him to handle. He could barely stop himself as Mrs. Thatcher's small jerk of the hand caused him to splooge with violence of a political clash with striking minors. His shirt was ruined, and he felt the sticky wetness seeping through the fabric on his chest, but neither party seemed to care. Ronald Regan had just had the most mind-blowing climax of his entire life, and Margaret Thatcher was rather proud. His body shuddered with the same ecstatic sensation that his very own CIA agents had felt upon sampling the LSD that was used in MK Ultra. He could barely stop his legs from shaking, trying to calm himself down. The joy he felt was tantamount to the feeling he was sure he would have got if the specter of communism had been crushed in that very instance. And to be honest, it almost felt as if it had. With Mrs. Thatcher by his side, he felt as if he could achieve anything that his heart and member most desired. "Good boy, Ronald," she said, standing back up, composing herself easily as the president struggled to clean himself off and get his semi-hard member back into his trousers. Do you want me to? He asked, clearly humiliated by how little he had done for her. Margaret gave a withering, almost pitying look. "Maybe next time. I think you might need a moment or so to recover, Mrs. President." Regan laughed uncomfortably, humiliated by the misgendering, but in a kind of hot, anti-communist way. "Okay, Mrs. Thatcher, whatever you say." Margaret looked down upon Regan, seeing beyond his superficial husk and realizing the pitiful little creature that he truly was. The presidency was perfect for him, if only to compensate for his personal deficiencies. Ronald managed to gather the strength to stand. The two pressed close again, sharing one last chaste and tender kiss. Thatcher turned to leave him. It was as if their love could achieve anything, even the most unrealistic things. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of communism. Above all else, it had certainly been confirmed that the US and UK had a special relationship. The end.